In November 2008, a single Zimbabwe dollar could buy you nothing. Not a loaf of bread, not a bus ticket, not a single egg. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe had printed a $100 trillion. Note a number so large it had no economic meaning, and it still wasn't enough to purchase a week's groceries. Teachers, nurses, civil servants, people who had spent entire careers saving in the only currency their country offered, watched those savings dissolve into vapor within months. Nobody had predicted it. The government, 2 years earlier, had called the economy stable. Right now, 3 measurable forces are converging inside the American financial system for the first time since 1929. Each one, alone, has historically been sufficient to destroy a generation of savings. Together, in the same window, they are aimed directly at the $7.4 trillion sitting in your 401k. This is what the pattern looks like before it completes. The Confederate dollar was born in 1861 with the full confidence of a government that controlled vast territory, substantial agricultural wealth, and the loyalty of millions of citizens. It was printed, spent, and trusted, used to pay soldiers, purchase supplies, finance the machinery of war. Confederate bonds were sold to ordinary Southern citizens who believed, with complete sincerity, that the new nation would prevail and that their savings would be honored. By April 1865, Confederate currency was worthless, not devalued, not restructured. Worthless. The citizens who had purchased Confederate bonds, teachers in Richmond, farmers in Georgia, merchants in Charleston, lost everything they had placed inside that system, not because they were foolish, because the system that gave their savings meaning had ceased to exist. The number on the paper remained. The value it represented had gone. This is the foundational lesson of financial history. And it is the lesson that the architects of the modern 401k system either did not learn or chose to ignore. A retirement vehicle is only as secure as the system that gives it value. Before 1978, the dominant American retirement model was the defined benefit pension, a contract in which a corporation guaranteed you a fixed monthly income for life, regardless of what markets did. The investment risk belonged to the employer. When the market fell, the company absorbed the blow. The worker's retirement was a promise, not a portfolio. That promise was systematically dismantled between 1980 and 2000. The 401k, born from a tax code amendment that most legislators didn't read, replaced the contract with a product. The product grew during the greatest bull market in American history. The growth looked like wisdom. It was, in large part, luck. The luck of participating in a 40-year expansion of asset prices that was driven by falling interest rates, globalization, and the unchallenged dominance of the US dollar. Post-war Japan rebuilt its economy on a similar architecture of institutional confidence. Japanese workers throughout the 1950s and 1960s saved faithfully in corporate pension systems backed by the explosive growth of Toyota, Sony, Hitachi, and Mitsubishi. The growth was real. The confidence was rational. And when the system that underpinned that confidence, the asset bubble of the late 1980s, reached its natural limit, the retirement expectations of an entire generation were quietly revised downward over 3 decades of stagnation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, at its peak in 1900, was home to a sophisticated middle class that saved in imperial bonds, municipal funds, and the instruments of a dual monarchy that had governed Central Europe for centuries. Those instruments were underwritten by institutional legitimacy that seemed unquestionable. By 1918, the empire had ceased to exist. The bonds were paper, the savings were gone. The $7.4 trillion in American 401k accounts is not guaranteed by any institution. It is not insured against market loss. It is fully exposed to the performance of asset markets at the precise moment when those markets face the most serious convergence of structural stresses in nearly a century. The Confederate bondholder did not lose their savings because they were reckless. They lost them because they placed complete faith in a system whose structural foundations were more fragile than its confidence suggested. 3 signs tell us those foundations are fracturing now. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse because it was weak. For 6 centuries, the Ottomans had been one of the most formidable political and military structures in human history, controlling territory from Budapest to Baghdad. From Algiers to the Persian Gulf, its treasury had financed the conquest of Constantinople, the subjugation of Egypt, the construction of the Topkapi Palace. It was, at its zenith, the most powerful state between China and France. By the late 19th century, it was called the sick man of Europe, not because its military had been defeated, not because its territory had shrunk dramatically, because its debt had consumed it from the inside. Between 1854 and 1875, the Ottoman Empire borrowed aggressively from European banks, primarily British and French, to finance modernization, military reform, and the maintenance of a court infrastructure that had been built for richer times. By 1875, approximately 50% of all Ottoman government revenue went directly to debt service. The government defaulted. European creditors established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a body that effectively controlled Ottoman fiscal policy on behalf of foreign bondholders. The empire had borrowed its sovereignty away, one bond issuance at a time, until the creditors owned its future. The United States in 2025 is not the Ottoman Empire, but the arithmetic is identical. U.S. national debt has crossed $36 trillion to 124% of GDP. Annual interest payments have exceeded $1.1 trillion, surpassing the defense budget for the first time in American history. The debt is not static. It compounds. As Lorette bonds issued in 2020 and 2021 mature and are refinanced at current rates, the interest burden rises automatically, not because the government borrows more, but because the existing debt becomes more expensive. The treadmill accelerates without anyone choosing to run faster. The French assignat experiment of the 1790s shows what happens next with surgical clarity. The revolutionary government, facing a fiscal crisis it could not resolve through taxation, issued paper currency backed by the value of confiscated church and aristocratic lands. Initially, the assignats circulated at par. The government printed more to cover deficits, and more. Within 5 years, the assignats had lost 97% of their value. Parisians carried them in wheelbarrows to purchase bread, not because France had no wealth, but because the mechanism connecting that wealth to the currency had been destroyed by the compounding logic of sovereign debt. Weimar Germany in 1923 compressed this process into months rather than years. The German government, facing reparations payments it could not fund through taxes, printed. By November 1923, the exchange rate stood at 4.2 trillion marks to $1. A worker paid on Friday who waited until Monday to spend his wages found that his paycheck could no longer purchase what it would have bought 72 hours earlier. The savings of the German middle class, accumulated across decades of disciplined thrift in a sophisticated industrial economy, were annihilated completely in less than 2 years. America will not become Weimar. The scale, the institutional depth, the dollar's global position make that direct comparison imprecise. But the direction of travel, more debt, higher interest costs, growing pressure toward monetary expansion as the path of least political resistance is not in question. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt reaching 166% of GDP by 2034. The interest payments projected for 2028 exceed the entire current discretionary budget. Sign number 1 is not a forecast, it is a measurement. The terminal phase of the debt supercycle has been entered. The Ottoman creditors, the French assignat holders, the German savers of 1921, none of them believed, in the years before the compression, that the system they trusted was capable of what it ultimately did to them. The second sign lives inside your quarterly statement, and it is, if anything, more immediately dangerous. In 1946, the Hungarian pang achieved something that no currency before or since has managed with such mathematical thoroughness. It became completely, totally, and instantaneously worthless. Hungarian post-war inflation peaked at 41.9 quadrillion % per month, a figure that requires a moment to absorb. Prices doubled every 15 hours. Workers were paid twice daily and immediately spent their wages before the next payment, because the money in their pockets lost measurable value while they stood at the cashier's counter. The Hungarian middle class, which had survived Nazi occupation and Soviet liberation, was financially annihilated by the inflation that followed. The savings of a lifetime could not purchase a single afternoon's groceries. The Hungarian pang collapsed because the government printed money to cover a fiscal hole that could not otherwise be filled. The mechanism was not unique. The scale was. The lesson for 2026 is not about Hungary. It is about what happens to asset prices when the monetary experiment that inflated them is forced to reverse. Between 2008 and 2022, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from $900 billion to $9 trillion. Interest rates were held near zero for most of that period. The result was the everything bubble, every major asset class, in every geography, inflating simultaneously because free money was searching for any return it could find. Stocks, bonds, real estate, crypto, art, all rose together. All were driven by the same input, an unprecedented monetary experiment. The Turkish lira's collapse after 2021 demonstrates the modern mechanism in compressed form. Turkey, under President Erdogan's unconventional monetary policy, held interest rates artificially low while inflation rose, essentially running a smaller-scale version of the global zero-rate experiment. The lira lost more than 80% of its value against the dollar between 2021 and 2023. Turkish citizens who had saved in lira-denominated accounts, teachers, small business owners, retirees, watched those accounts lose most of their real value within 2 years. The nominal numbers on their statements barely changed. The purchasing power they represented was largely gone. The Shiller-Cape ratio, the most reliable long-term equity valuation measure in financial research, entered 2026 at approximately 37. The historical average is 17. Every time in American financial history, this ratio has exceeded 30. A major market decline has followed. Every time, declines have ranged from 40% to 89%. The Cape ratio does not determine timing. It has never failed to determine direction. The 2022 experience added a specific, new danger. For the first time since 1969, stocks and bonds fell together. The traditional 60/40 retirement portfolio, the standard allocation for millions of American retirees, lost between 16% and 21% in a single calendar year. The shock absorber failed. The mechanism that every retirement advisor had relied upon for 40 years, the countercyclical relationship between stocks and bonds, broke at precisely the moment it was needed most. It broke because both assets had been inflated by the same experiment. When the experiment reversed, both deflated together. The Argentine peso parallel is instructive here, not in its currency dimension, which belongs to sin number 3, but in its asset price dimension. Argentine savers who had placed retirement assets in peso-denominated instruments during the growth years of the 1990s discovered, when the system broke, that their diversified portfolios shared a single fatal common factor. They were all denominated in a currency and priced within a system that was simultaneously failing. American 401k holders have the same single fatal common factor. Every asset in the standard portfolio, domestic equities, domestic bonds, money market funds, is denominated in US dollars and priced within a system facing a currency challenge unlike anything it has encountered in 50 years. That challenge is sin number 3. On September 21, 1931, the British government made an announcement that stunned the financial world. Britain was leaving the gold standard. The pound sterling, the currency that had underwritten the British Empire, financed the defeat of Napoleon, sustained the Industrial Revolution, served as the world's reserve currency for more than a century, was being untethered from gold. The announcement came on a Sunday evening, through a government statement so understated in its language that it took the financial press several hours to fully process its implications. By Monday morning, the pound had fallen 25% against the dollar. By the end of the year, 25 other countries had followed Britain off gold. The immediate cause was a banking crisis and a run on British gold reserves that the government judged impossible to sustain. The structural cause was deeper. Britain had emerged from the First World War carrying debt that made the pre-war gold parity economically undefendable. The debt load had made the gold standard a fiction. September 1931 was simply the moment the fiction was formally abandoned. The British citizens most harmed were those who had saved in sterling-denominated instruments on the assumption that the currency's purchasing power backed by the gold standard and the empire's global reach would remain stable. It contracted steadily and then sharply across the following decades, as the reserve currency premium that sterling had enjoyed since Waterloo gradually transferred to the dollar. The OPEC oil embargo of October 1973 demonstrated the same vulnerability from a different angle. When Arab members of OPEC halted oil exports to the United States and other nations supporting Israel, the immediate effect was an oil price spike from $3 to $12 per barrel. But the deeper effect was a revelation. The United States, the world's most powerful economy, could be brought to the edge of recession by the decisions of a handful of oil-producing states. The dollar's dominance, real as it was, rested on energy dependency that could be weaponized. The petrodollar system, the 1974 arrangement that made Saudi oil sales dollar-denominated, was constructed specifically to prevent a recurrence of 1973. It worked. For 50 years, it worked magnificently. And now, it is fraying. Germany's gold repatriation program, which began in 2013, tells the story in a single institutional decision. Germany held approximately 3,400 tons of gold, much of it stored at the Federal Reserve in New York and the Banque de France in Paris, a legacy of Cold War security arrangements. Beginning in 2013, Germany quietly requested its gold back. The repatriation took 7 years to complete. Germany did not announce this as a statement of distrust in American institutions. It was framed as a routine administrative rationalization. The financial press understood the signal. The country most integrated into the American-led financial order after World War II, the anchor of the European economy, America's most important NATO ally, had decided, at the highest levels of its central bank, that it preferred to hold its gold reserves at home rather than in New York. When Germany moves gold, others notice. When Saudi Arabia discusses yuan-denominated oil sales, when the BRICS bloc builds alternative payment systems, when the dollar's share of global reserves falls from 73% to 58% in 23 years, none of these are isolated events. They are the accumulating evidence of a reserve currency in the early stages of structural decline. Britain in 1931 did not lose reserve currency status overnight. The process had begun decades earlier, was accelerated by 2 world wars, and completed formally at Bretton Woods only in 1944, but the British saver who held sterling-denominated assets from 1931 through to 1950 experienced the full cost of that transition in real purchasing power, in real retirement income, in real life. The dollar's retreat will follow the same arc. Slower than Zimbabwe, faster than anyone currently comfortable with the system wishes to believe. Your 401k is measured in dollars. The dollar is changing. The 3 signs have been identified. Now the question becomes, what does their simultaneous convergence actually do to $7.4 trillion in retirement accounts? In 1917, the Russian aristocracy lost everything in a matter of weeks. Not in battle, not through bankruptcy. Through the simple, violent fact that the system within which their wealth existed, the czarist political and economic order, ceased to function. The estates, the bonds, the bank accounts, the business interests that had defined the wealth of Russia's property class for generations did not decline gradually. They were simply voided. The legal framework that gave them value was replaced overnight by a different legal framework that did not recognize private property in the same way. The Russian aristocrats who had managed to move assets outside Russia before 1917 into Swiss banks and to London property, into foreign securities, survived. Some rebuilt. The aristocrats whose wealth existed entirely within the Russian system lost it entirely. Not because they had been imprudent by the standards of their time, because they had been prudent by the standards of a system whose standards were about to change permanently. The Irish famine of the 1840s adds a structural dimension. The catastrophe that killed 1 million Irish people and forced another million to emigrate was not caused by the failure of the potato crop alone. It was caused by the legal architecture of land ownership that prevented Irish tenant farmers from retaining any portion of their productive output when that output failed. The landlords operating within a perfectly legal system extracted rent from people who were starving because the system entitled them to do so. The peasants had no assets outside the system. When the system worked against them, they had nothing. The Venezuelan oil paradox reveals the modern version. Venezuela held the world's largest proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada. By any rational measure, this was wealth. It was real wealth, in the ground geologically verified. Yet Venezuelan citizens in 2018 could not purchase basic food. The wealth existed. The monetary and institutional system through which citizens access wealth had been destroyed. The oil was in the ground. People went hungry. The 2026 to 2028 window is the convergence point at which all three signs are simultaneously at their most acute. The debt interest clock has crossed $1 trillion annually and rises automatically. The CAPE ratio sits at 37. The dollar's reserve share is falling. Commercial real estate carries $1.5 trillion in loans that cannot be refinanced at viable economics. The baby boom retirement wave is converting 401k accounts from net buyers to net sellers at the worst possible moment. Individual triggers could arrive from any direction. Commercial real estate cascade that destabilizes regional banks. A debt ceiling crisis that produces a genuine, rather than symbolic, credit event. A geopolitical shock that spikes oil prices and forces the Federal Reserve into an impossible choice between inflation and recession. A confidence event in the Treasury market brief, perhaps contained but sufficient to reveal that the assumption of limitless safe haven demand for American debt is not as unconditional as it has appeared. The Russian aristocrat's error was not choosing the wrong investments within the system, it was placing all confidence in the permanence of the system itself. The Irish tenant farmer's catastrophe was not caused by his agricultural decisions. It was caused by having no assets that existed outside the legal framework that was destroying him. The Venezuelan citizen's tragedy was not ignorance of his country's wealth. It was the complete dependence of his daily purchasing power on institutions that failed him. Each of these patterns, the system that voids its promises, the legal architecture that turns against its participants, the wealth that cannot be accessed when the mechanism connecting wealth to daily life breaks, has a specific documented translation into the American retirement context. Those translations are the three scenarios. In 1994, Yugoslavia's successor states were experiencing an inflation so severe that economists struggled to measure it. The Yugoslav dinar, successor to a currency that had once underpinned a functioning middle income, economy was being reprinted in denominations that increased by factors of 1,000 every few months. The National Bank issued a 500 billion note, then a 500 billion note. Citizens learned to spend the moment they received payment because the dinar's value measured in hours rather than days. Retired Yugoslav citizens, people who had worked for 30 years in factories and schools and hospitals, contributing faithfully to a pension system that was denominated in a currency that was now worthless, found that their monthly pension payment could not purchase a kilogram of bread. Three scenarios describe how the American 401k system absorbs the convergence. Each has historical precedent. Each is documented. They are not predictions. They are the documented range of outcomes from prior convergences of this type. Scenario A, the silent drain. Inflation persists at 5 to 7% annually for a decade. Nominal 401k balances stagnate. The account reads $600,000. The retirement it funds purchases what $380,000 buys today. No dramatic event, no obvious crisis. It's just the patient, silent confiscation of purchasing power. The same mechanism the Yugoslav dinar enacted in weeks, operating over years. The saver never receives a letter explaining what has happened. The quarterly statement still shows a number. Number still looks like retirement. Scenario B, the sharp correction. The CAPE ratio at 37 reverts toward its historical mean of 17, a 50% market decline, the midpoint of the historical range following. CAPE readings above 30 translates directly. The $800,000 account becomes $400,000. The 65-year-old retiring in 2027 is half the retirement they planned. The 58-year-old has time to recover, theoretically. The Nika took 34 years. The Nasdaq took 15. Recovery is not guaranteed within any individual's working life. The Icelandic pension experience of 2008 illustrates the institutional dimension of Scenario B when Iceland's banking system collapsed in October 2008. Pension funds that had invested in the bonds of Kaupthing, Landsbanki, and Glitnir, bonds that had been rated investment grade weeks before the collapse, discovered overnight that those assets were worthless. Icelandic pension funds lost approximately 25% of their real value in a single quarter. Recovery took years. Pensioners who needed withdrawals during the recovery window experienced the full loss. Scenario C, the legislative response. This is the scenario that most retirement savers find psychologically impossible to engage with, because it requires accepting that the laws governing their accounts are not permanent. They are political choices. The Nicaraguan Cordoba of the 1980s illustrates the mechanism. The Sandinista government, facing fiscal crisis, enacted currency reforms that effectively converted savings held in old Cordobas to new Cordobas at rates that dramatically reduced their real value. The conversion was legal. It was legislated. Old citizens who had saved in the old currency received the new currency at terms determined by a government whose primary concern was its own fiscal survival, not their retirement security. The 401k exists because Congress created it. Its tax advantages, its contribution limits, its distribution rules, its investment options. Every aspect is a legislative choice that can be revised by a different legislative majority facing different fiscal pressures. Mandatory Treasury allocation requirements, forcing a percentage of 401k assets into government bonds to help finance the deficit, is not a hypothetical. It has appeared in academic policy literature and congressional testimony. Wealth taxes applied above certain account thresholds exist in multiple European countries. Emergency conversion mechanisms have Supreme Court validated precedent in Executive Order 6102. None of these scenarios is inevitable. Each is documented. Each has happened in a country that, before it happened, believed itself too sophisticated, developed, too institutionally strong for such things to be possible. Cyprus believed that. Iceland believed that. Argentina believed that. Yugoslavia believed that. The belief does not change the arithmetic. It only delays the preparation. The Byzantine Empire's treasury kept meticulous records. From its founding as the Eastern Roman Empire in 330 AD to its final collapse in 1453, Byzantine financial administrators maintained accounts of revenue, expenditure, military costs, and monetary reserves with a precision that modern historians still find remarkable. Those records tell a story that no Byzantine emperor wished to hear, but that the numbers made unavoidable. The empire's fiscal position deteriorated in an almost perfectly linear fashion across its final 2 centuries, with brief recoveries that each proved shallower than the decline that preceded them. The Byzantine administrators who read those records understood what was coming. The political and military leadership, whose authority depended on projecting confidence, preferred the fiction of stability. The result was an empire that continued to function, coins minted, laws enforced, ceremonies conducted, while the structural foundations of its survival quietly gave way beneath the performance of its continuity. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was, in the 17th century, the most valuable corporation in human history. At its peak in 1637, the VOC's market capitalization exceeded that of all major companies operating in the world today, adjusted for the size of the global economy. Its shares were held by Dutch citizens of every class: merchants, craftsmen, sailors, widows who had invested their husbands' inheritance. The VOC paid dividends consistently, issued bonds reliably, and projected the image of institutional permanence for more than a century. It was formally dissolved in 1799, insolvent. The Dutch citizens who held VOC shares and bonds at the end received nothing. The world's most valuable corporation had consumed itself through mismanagement, debt, and the slow erosion of the competitive advantages that had made it dominant. The shareholders lost everything, not in a single dramatic event. In a long, slow, thoroughly documented decline that each individual year looked manageable, and that across a century looked like the destruction of a civilization's savings. During the Second World War, the Swiss franc became the refuge of last resort for European wealth that had no other safe harbor. Jewish families fleeing Germany, aristocrats escaping occupied France, business owners throughout occupied Europe, those who could move assets to Switzerland, did so, because Switzerland maintained a currency backed by gold, a legal system that honored contracts, and a political neutrality that kept it outside the conflict consuming the continent. The Swiss franc's stability during the greatest financial disruption of the 20th century was not accidental. It was the product of institutional decisions: a hard currency, fiscal restraint, political independence, and an explicit commitment to asset protection regardless of the political pressures surrounding it. Switzerland paid a price for that commitment. It sacrificed the short-term stimulus that currency debasement might have provided, the cheap borrowing that deficit spending enables, the popularity of promises that cannot be kept. The Swiss middle class retained its savings through the war. The German, French, Italian, and Austrian middle classes did not. The Cuban exiles of 1959 demonstrate the final lesson. When Fidel Castro nationalized businesses and banks following the revolution, Cuban citizens who had built professional careers accumulated real estate and saved in peso-denominated accounts discovered that the legal framework defining their ownership had been replaced overnight. The peso accounts were accessible, but the peso's value in a nationalized economy cut off from global markets rapidly contracted. The Cuban professionals who had sent money abroad maintained foreign accounts, diversified across currencies and geographies, survived the transition with something. Those who had kept everything inside the Cuban financial system lost everything inside the Cuban financial system. This documentary has presented 7 sections of historical evidence, 30 unique examples drawn from 5 centuries and 6 continents. The pattern across all of them is not complicated. It can be stated simply. When a sovereign's debt reaches its terminal phase, the savings of those who trusted the sovereign are at risk. When asset prices reach historic extremes, the savings of those most exposed at the peak pay the price of the correction. When a reserve currency loses its structural privilege, the savings denominated in that currency lose the invisible premium that privilege provided. When all 3 occur simultaneously, the consequences are not additive. They are compounding. Each sign amplifies the others. The window in which they converge is the 2026 to 2028 period, and the evidence for each sign is not projection, it is measurement. The Byzantine administrators who read the treasury records could not stop what was coming. But those who acted on what the records told them, who prepared, diversified, moved, adapted, navigated the compression differently from those who trusted the performance of stability over the evidence of the numbers. The VOC shareholder who held to the end received nothing. The one who read the accounts and acted lost less than everything. The Swiss saver retained what the German saver lost, not through luck, not through superior intelligence, but through the simple discipline of not placing complete faith in a single system at a single system, at a moment when that system was showing the documented signs of structural stress. The pattern has run its course many times. It is running now. It has never lied.